Once upon a time, USB 2 was fast enough. Back when we were only transferring text documents and the odd, .gif image or GIF, depending who you ask. But now files are getting much bigger and our needs are expanding. Not only do we need larger storage on our small devices, but we also need much faster storage. So we're going to be talking today about what kind of a performance difference you can really get going all the way from something like a commodity, inexpensive USB 2 flash drive all the way up to a super premium, expensive USB 3 one, such as the HyperX from Kingston. Now, besides just generally, yeah, it's great to have more storage and have it be faster, I mean, how are our storage needs changing in the future such that we're really going to need this? Well, number one is, aside from HD videos, there's also going to be things like, DSLR photos are getting bigger and bigger all the time. If you're someone who shoots RAW, for example, those files are enormous. And you also want to make sure that even though you could fill a USB 2 drive that's very large with a bunch of RAW photos, you need it to be fast enough that it's responsive enough you could actually work directly off of the device without enormous slowdowns. So other examples might be things like as 3D printing gets more prevalent and you want something that you can throw a 3D model on and you can go take it to the print shop, or when they become more consumer grade, you could move them around and print them at home or at a friend's house. That kind of thing is going to be important too. So there you go, guys. We need more storage, we need it to be faster, and we're going to be looking at these in a few different ways. So number one is we're going to be using the synthetic test, Blackmagic disk speed test, and then we're going to be doing 3 real-world tests. So one of them is with a bunch of smaller files. So there are a bunch of photos totaling around 450 megs. Then 2 larger file tests. So one with a lot of 720p video files, and that one's totaling around 4.5 gigs, and then another one that has a single 1080p file that is around 3.5 gigs. So these are timed using Teracopy to give you a really, truly real-world example of how fast each of these drives are that represents different segmentations within the market. So there's a very, very small, compact data traveler drive from Kingston. This is the DT109. I'd consider this more like a commodity drive, and that one is USB 2. So that represents USB 2 in our testing. We've also got a couple more sort of entry-level USB 3 drives, so the Supersonic XT from Patriot, as well as the Data Traveler 100G3 from Kingston. So those are the next tier. Then we've got a couple positioned as high-performance USB 3 drives, including the UE700 from AData, as well as the HyperX from Kingston. And last but not least, the HyperX from Kingston was tested in USB 2 mode as well. So let's talk results, guys. These numbers were run by the one and only NCIX wheels, and we're going to start with the Blackmagic write test. So the Kingston HyperX pretty much runs away with it, with the Dash Drive Elite coming significantly behind, and all the other drives performing pretty much as if they look like they were running on USB 2. Remember, Flash is much more difficult to write to quickly than it is to read from quickly, and that's what we're going to see here in the read test, where all of the drives perform dramatically better, even the HyperX, which already performed quite well. So this is where we're seeing those rated speeds of around 260 megabytes per second actually start to look even slower than what can be attained in the real world by this drive, or at least in a synthetic benchmark. In our small files test, we see everyone pretty much tank. Writes particularly with smaller files are extremely difficult because of the way that the flash needs to be erased and then reprogrammed, and a lot of steps are involved in it. So only the HyperX 3.0 is able to really sustain what I'd consider USB 3 grade speeds in this particular test. When we switch over to reads, it's a bit of a different story, with the HyperX coming out ahead, but with 3 of the other USB 3 drives looking pretty reasonable as well. Next, we're moving on to the medium files transfer test, and we see pretty much the same old story. When we're looking at writes, the Kingston HyperX is way out in front, with the Dash Drive Elite from AData a second, and everything else looking pretty much like it could be running on USB 2. Next up, Reading. Okay. Well, all those other USB 3 drives, they are exceeding the USB 2 maximum spec. You can tell because with the HyperX running on USB 2, it is slower than the Data Traveler 100G3, the Supersonic Boost XT, as well as the Dash Drive Elite. But it looks like, once again, we're only really getting the benefit when it comes to read speeds from those other USB 3 drives. Finally, there's the large file transfer test, where the HyperX 3.0 wins, the Dash Drive Elite comes in second, and everything else is slower. And finally, reads on large files. This is where all the drives really start to look like they perform about like what you'd expect. The HyperX 3.0 inexplicably fell a little bit behind on this test, but given how well it performs in what I'd consider to be the more real-world scenarios where you're transferring a mix of different file sizes, we're definitely going to give that the win in this particular benchmark suite. So what have we learned in all of this? Well, manufacturers, it looks like they're presenting their drives more in terms of how they perform when you're transferring an individual large file instead of a more real-world scenario where it's multiple smaller files. You understand why they do this because it's kind of a best-case scenario. How well can this drive perform in ideal conditions? But the reality of it is most of us aren't going to be using our thumb drives like that. So what would manufacturers have to do in order to attain those same speeds with small files as they can with large ones? Well, number one is they'd need faster flash, and number two is they would need much more advanced controllers built into these, which would do a number of things. It would increase power consumption, it would increase the size, and it would dramatically increase the cost. Well, then you're looking at an SSD. And when you look at the price difference in dollars per gig between something like even a high-end USB thumb drive versus an SSD, it'll probably start to make sense to you why manufacturers aren't doing this. Because if you really wanted to have an external SSD, there are options out there. You can go buy one of those. However, at least I hope this gave you some idea of how these drives perform when you go all the way from commodity USB 2 all the way up to performance USB 3, and gave you a bit of an idea of who is speccing the drives according to what kind of transfers they're expecting you to do. Don't forget to subscribe to NCIX Tech Tips for more videos like this from your favorite detailer, NCIX.com.